When women want to get into strength training, we're usually told one of two things. We might be told, okay, don't do strength training because you'll get too bulky. Or if you're talking to somebody who's maybe particularly interested in lifting, they might say to you, oh, you can lift, don't worry, you won't get bulky. But either way, we're suggesting that bulky is something with this negative connotation. And so when I started writing this chapter of the book, I thought, okay, the first thing I have to do is look up what is the definition of bulky? Why do we fear this so much? And so the definition is taking up much space, typically inconveniently.
Right.
And I read that and I thought, oh, this makes so much sense now, right? Because of course, if a woman is taking up space, it's considered inconvenient, right?
All right. Alyssa Ages, welcome to the Better podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. All right. So I wanted to interview you because of a book that you wrote, The Secrets of Giants. And I think that there she is. Yeah. If you're watching it on YouTube. Yeah. I love that. And I think that there's so many wonderful lessons in some of the stories that you share in this book. And I wanted to actually dive right in you are a strongman competitor, and you detail sort of, prepping for these competitions and what it sort of took mentally, physically, nutrition wise and all of that. And there was a part in the book, and it was later on, so I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I wanted to start here. I read this part of the book a couple of times, which is the ever-changing target of what a female body should look like. What femininity, and I'm using air quotes for those of you that are listening, what femininity is, if too much muscle is actually, bulky. So let's actually just start with the bulky, I actually smirked when I read this, the bulky definition. Do you remember what it is that you wrote in the book?
I do. And it's funny because every time I say it out loud, I get that same, people are like, oh, everyone kind of gives that little laugh. Yeah. So basically I came to this because this, when women want to get into strength training, we're usually told one of two things. So we might be told, okay, don't do strength training because you'll get too bulky. Or if you're talking to somebody who's maybe particularly interested in lifting, they might say to you, oh, you can lift, don't worry, you won't get bulky. But either way, we're suggesting that bulky is something with this negative connotation. And so when I started writing this chapter of the book, I thought, okay, the first thing I have to do is look up what is the definition of bulky? Why do we fear this so much? And so the definition is taking up much space, typically inconveniently.
Right.
And I read that and I thought, oh, this makes so much sense now, right? Because of course, if a woman is taking up space, it's considered inconvenient. Right? Maybe it's inconvenient because it's thought that she's taking that space from a man. Maybe it's inconvenient because we expect women to be diminutive and weak and smaller. Maybe it's inconvenient because we're challenging gender norms with the way that our body looks when we've put on visible muscle. But that was a really kind of fascinating way to start that portion of the book for me.
And it's interesting too, because when we look at when we look at sort of male dominated magazines, it's sort of this Adonis complex that are this like, be bigger, be more, take up more space, bigger shoulders, bigger lats, bigger quads, bigger. And for women, to your point, it's like, become small, become toned, become more delicate, become more ladylike with more muscles. Like the messaging is, it's the exact same exercise. And of course, there are sex differences, and thank God for that. Like, I'm very happy to be, a woman.
Yeah.
And when I am lifting, when I am using some of the principles of progressive overload, my intention is to grow. Am I able to grow? I train with my husband. So am I able to lift as much as him? In some lifts I am, but not all. Like for the majority, I'm not. But my goal is I want to put on muscle. Like I want muscle. And I have been working very, very hard, diligently for the better part of several decades to try and, it's like, and weightlifting sometimes is just like kind of a game of inches and centimeters, right? But I was really struck by this. And then you mentioned in the book, which I have started a wild goose chase for, the Pumping Iron 2, the women. So I watched Pumping Iron, I don't know how many
Yeah.
times when I was younger. I also was a big fan of American Gladiators. I don't know if you ever watched
Me
American
too.
Gladiators.
Me
Oh
too.
my God.
Yes. Growing up, I loved it.
Loved them, like
Yeah.
Ice and Storm and like all the women. I was like, oh my God, I have to look. Like these women were,
You got to watch the documentary on
I
them.
did. I watched it. It was incredible, incredible. It's
Yeah.
sad in some ways as well. But I think that what we need to sort of redefine is like taking up more space is actually okay. And I've sort of said this tongue in cheek in the past, where I remember when I would take the subway, I would take the metro or whatever, wherever I was going. And if there was a guy sitting beside me, he would just like spread eagle, like legs are out. He's like, and I'm just sort of like trying to like stay in my chair, like not have anyone touch me. And I think that that's a really good parable for this sort of bulky paradigm that we have for women, where it's like, don't get too big, get small, little and petite. So how can we move, or maybe you can outline your own personal, because you were very frank in the book as well about your own views on diets always being restrictive. There's always supposed to be a caloric deficit. You're always supposed to have six packs, abs. Maybe you can detail for us your own personal evolution with this idea of bulkiness or putting on muscle and how that's changed over time.
Yeah. I mean, the chapter you're talking about was the hardest chapter in the book for me to write. I don't think I realized it was going to be. I thought that I would start with this kind of coming from this place of being, more interested in being small. And that by the end of it, I was going to go, nope, all I care about is getting bigger, and it doesn't matter what I look like. It's just about what I can do. And that's, it's not human to go from one end of the spectrum to the other that easily.
Just like that.
It was, yeah, it was really a back and forth. But basically, I was training for a national level strongman competition. And even though I was in the lightweight class, I knew I was going to be going up against women who are a lot stronger than me. And when you're competing in strength, what you want is to be at the top level of your weight class, just underneath that cutoff, right? So if my weight class was it was the 123 and under. And so I wanted to be right at the top of that. But I wanted to do that with muscle. So for a couple of months, I worked with my coach on building mass. And he was like, well, okay, if you want to do that, you have to eat more food. And what I thought, okay, no problem. I'll just eat more food. Everybody wants to be told they can eat more food. But what I would find was that when I was doing that, I was this constant back and forth battle of remembering that for the longest time, for as much of my life as I can remember, I would see hunger pangs as kind of like this sign that I was doing something right? That I could withhold. I had the discipline to wait. And I almost enjoyed that feeling. And so now eating with purpose and intent for putting on mass instead of getting smaller was really confusing and really difficult to do for a long time. And throughout the process, I would find that my lifts were going up from eating more and training more. And sometimes I would find that maybe I could see more visible muscle in my arms, but my jeans didn't fit as well, because you're not putting on mass in like certain spots that you just want to put it on.
It's not just your deltoids.
And every time, yeah. And every time that happened, every time I would, go down to the gym and I would, PR my overhead press. And then I would come back home and I'd go to get dressed for the day and my jeans didn't fit right. It was this battle back and forth between what matters more. And I can't even truly say that I'm at a point where I just think, okay, my strength matters the most. It's always going to go back and forth for me. But the thing that this made me do that I'm the proudest of is it made me at least question it. So now instead of putting on a pair of pants that don't fit perfectly and just thinking that I'm this terrible failure at life, I now go, why do you feel that way? And what does matter more to you? And I kind of have the tools now, I guess, to go, okay, you have to really think about why you feel like that and question that. And more times than not, I'm more excited about what I can do with my body.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting. And part of the reason why I wanted to start here is because I enjoyed reading the unraveling there in terms of, and to your point, it's not going to happen immediately. This is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be several years, because you have to think about it's several years that you've been decades even, that we've been
Decades.
programmed in this way to be small and diminutive, as you said, and ladylike and petite and toned, and all of these sort of marketing that we've been told to just smile and don't take up space and don't be difficult. And it's often the women who challenge that predisposition around women being small and quiet, who are often called difficult, who are often called, they're often called bitches or whatever, right? And usually those are the most interesting women, right? When they've sort of unhitched over time, as you have done, unhitched over time the purpose, or redefining what the purpose of your body is. So you've talked about, maybe you're still struggling with it. And I think that, we all do, myself included. Yeah. But if you can redefine the purpose of your body, in your case, how can I test the finite limits of my matter to build strength? Then we can start to heal some of these unintentional or I would say unintentional wounds that have been cast on us as women, as a society as a whole.
Absolutely. And, I'm also a mom of 2 young girls. Right. And one of the things that's the most important to me is not passing on all of that like messy body image stuff to them. So, I am really careful around them that even if I don't feel great in my body one day, I don't say that in front of them. I don't disparage my body in front of them. I bring them we have a gym in our garage. I bring them into the garage gym and I let them see me succeeding at lifts. I let them see me failing at lifts. I let them try and pick up stuff in the garage and, what do they want to try to do? And I see that without me kind of explicitly sitting them down and saying, dieting is bad and love your body. They're just kind of getting that. We were sitting at breakfast recently and I noticed that the 2 of them, so one of them is almost 6 and the other one just turned 4, and they were arguing with each other. And I kind of listened in a little bit more and realized they were having an argument about who was stronger. They were flexing their muscles at each other and arguing about who was stronger.
Proud mom moment.
And I was like,
yeah.
Yes, I did something right.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And, in many ways, as you were describing this sort of unraveling of your beliefs around your body, it sort of reminded me of pregnancy because when I first got pregnant or wanting to get pregnant, because I'd spent all of my, sort of young adult and up until that point trying not to get pregnant. And then all of a sudden I was like, actually, now we're going to let those little swimmers up. We're going to, we're going to let them, we're going to open up shop and make babies now. So it was a little bit of backwards land for me for a little bit. I was like, oh my gosh, we're not using any protection. Oh my goodness, we're going to do this. And I think it was parallel for me that way, because I remember feeling and saying to my husband at the time, when we were first trying to conceive our children, gosh, like this feels really like almost naughty in a way, because it's like I had spent all my life, growing up Catholic and all that kind of stuff sort of overlays on top of it as well, where you're thinking, this is the way that it is. Like I have to not get pregnant. And then when it's time to get pregnant, it just feels so wrong. And I wanted to just, give that as an example, as another way that we sort of have this sort of these goalposts or these walls in terms of what's right and what's not. And then when we can start to sort of question and maybe expand the wall a little bit, it leaves room for questions. It leaves room for self-exploration. And in your case, you found something that truly, lights you up. So this is also like a wonderful event from it as well.
Yeah. And I think truly, and it's interesting, I wrote a piece for Elle about this recently. I don't know as women that most of us can think of any point in our lives where we've had full autonomy over our bodies, maybe until you get into your 40s. But for the most part, your entire life, you've been told what to do with your body, right? It's just every little thing that can possibly be controlled is you're getting suggestions on how to control that from the outside, right? Even that starts at puberty, right? Like, plug your bleeding, strap something over your breasts, do all this stuff. And then you talk about the pregnancy stuff. I could go off on a whole thing about this, but the truth is, like, we're told for so much of our lives, don't get pregnant. That's on you. You are in charge of you not getting pregnant. And did anyone ever tell us when we were younger that you might not get pregnant, by the way? Like when you do actually want it, maybe that's not going to happen. Yeah. We're sort of never really given the tools to figure this stuff out on our own.
Yeah.
And that's really troublesome.
It is, yeah. And, as I've written a book on menstrual cycle literacy, and it's unbelievable. I have women in my 30s and in their 30s and their 40s contacting me saying, I never have tracked my cycle. I have never understood how my body changes over the course of the month. And when we look at fertility, there's only about 6 days, when we sort of look at it physiologically, it's only about 6 days, maybe 7, depending on your age, that you can get pregnant. Like the other 21 days, it's impossible. But, again, I'm not poo-pooing on any religion. I'm just talking about my own experience. Like I used to think, I've said this on the show before, I used to think that when I was younger that I could get pregnant from going in a swimming pool. Like that's how scared I was of getting pregnant. I don't know who told me that. I don't know. It was like some kid, like, I don't know how that was, occupying space in my mind without my consent, but there it was. And I brought up the pregnancy piece as well, because I wanted to also segue into your own experience. You were very candid in the book talking about your miscarriage. So I wondered if we could, if you feel comfortable, of course, we can cut this out if you are like, this is a hard no for me.
No, it's literally I was going to be like, I'm an open book. It's quite literally
in the book. Okay. So talk to us a little bit about so we have this traumatic event, right? So you've decided I want to get pregnant, and you have this you're going to your families over the holidays, and you have this whole idea of how you're going to tell them, and then things don't happen the way that you were planning. Tell us a little bit about how lifting for you and resistance training at that time maybe was a lifeline.
Yeah. So it's interesting because there was this mix of wanting to go back to the gym, and then also this little bit of feeling guilty. And, I'll kind of backtrack into the story a bit, but basically I found out I was pregnant that first time because I had been at the gym lifting and just felt this really intense exhaustion. And it was so different than any exhaustion I'd had from working out that was the trigger for me to go home and take a pregnancy test. And when I ultimately found out that I was miscarrying 6 weeks later, I had this kind of feeling of guilt, like maybe I had done something in the gym that day, because that was the first time I found out I was pregnant. And then it was, so quickly afterwards that I found out that it wasn't going to be a viable pregnancy. But going back to the gym, it felt like getting back to myself. And for a while when I was doing that, I couldn't really pinpoint it. I just knew that when I would walk out of the gym on those days, I went from kind of walking around sort of slumped over and feeling like I wanted to crawl into myself to carrying myself with my shoulders pulled back and my head held high and feeling like I could kind of take on the world, and I could maybe trust my body a little bit more again, or at least my body's ability to endure hard things and my brain's ability to endure hard things. But I didn't really know at the time why that was the case. And one of the most powerful things I learned researching this book, and this was really from just individual research, from original research of talking to people versus reading any studies about this particular part of it. But I spoke to 2 different women who work with people who've gone through trauma and help them heal from that trauma through lifting weights, which was really fascinating to me. And in talking to them, they explained that, in the act of lifting something heavy, you have to trust your body in that moment. And what I realized was that when I would go in and let's say I was going to do a heavy deadlift, right? Maybe I'm wearing my weight belt. And in order to lift that weight safely, I have to brace my core, right? That's going to help protect my back. So I'm going to breathe out into my belt. I'm going to feel my abdomen pressing up against this belt. And to lift that bar from the ground safely, I have to believe that this part of my body that was this home to just immense sadness and weakness and vulnerability could also be a place of strength. And I realized when I found that out, looking back on that time in my life, oh, that's why it was so powerful, because it forced me to trust myself in a way that I wasn't really comfortable doing.
And well, first of all, did anyone ever tell you that it wasn't your fault that you were lifting, that you miscarried? Like, did any physician or?
Yes.
They did? Okay.
Yes. My wonderful, after the miscarriage, I ended up also going to a fertility clinic because so when I got pregnant that first time, it was literally the first time we tried. And then after that, it just kept not happening month after month after month. And I had a wonderful fertility doctor, and he said to me, like, this is, you didn't do this, right? Like, this is not, you didn't cause this by going to the gym. This was going to happen anyway. And it's just unfortunate that was the timing that you experienced it.
Right. Because you messed up the chronological, because you found out and then you miscarried and you happened to be in the gym. Yeah. And then we can sort of chronologically link events and make some meaning from it. But yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, so I love this because I think that there can be, I love what you said about there can be such immense sadness, but there can, from that same place, there can also be this place of strength and courage and confidence. And I think that one of the reasons I like that so much is I think that maybe an art that is somewhat being lost is this idea that we can hold two truths at the same time. Like there can be two things at opposite ends of the spectrum that we can sort of hold simultaneously. So there can be this grief and this sadness in your body, in your womb. And then there can also be, you know, just as you sort of described, like you have to, in order to lift something like your core, which includes, you know, pelvic floor and the diaphragm, the core and all that, all of that also has to be, there has to be an integrity there and a connection, you know, this sort of somatic, you know, this brain body connection that exists. So I think that that's also maybe a point. I don't know if you were intending to make that point, but I think that it's an important one, that we can hold two things true at the same time that are not necessarily the same.
Yeah. Yeah. And that we don't have to, you know, one of the people I spoke to, she phrased it really well, where she said trauma recovery isn't linear, right? You don't go from point A to point B in just this one motion where it's like everything is bad and then everything is good. It goes back and forth. And that she made the connection that lifting weights is very much like that. You don't go into the gym day after day and lift a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more every single time you go in. Otherwise, we would all have a 3,000-pound deadlift by now, right? It doesn't work that way. You go in, you lift a little bit more today, and then maybe next time you go in and you kind of backtrack a little bit. And that's okay, because then you're going to go in and it's going to be better maybe the next time that you go in. And that's trauma recovery is very similar to that.
And it's also such a long, one of the reasons why I love exercise. Yes, I love it for the strength. Yes, I love it for the aesthetics and all of that. But it's also, it teaches you almost like a surrender to the monotony. Like you're going to go in and you're going to do the same thing. And at least my journey with lifting weights has been, it stays the same for a really long time. And then you get to put on another 2.5 or 5 pounds or whatever it is, like depending on the, depending on the exercise you're doing and the muscles or whatever, but it stays the same for a long time. And then it's sort of, at least for me, comes out of nowhere. And it's like, I can do an extra 25 on each, I can put an extra 25 on each side now. Out of nowhere. And then that becomes your new normal. And then you do that for another, whatever, however many months. And I think, with trauma, it's the same thing. It's like things just feel the same, but that's the work. It's doing the same things. Oh, it's like dedicating to your meditation practice or your breath work or savoring a quiet moment or, checking in with your body and auto-regulating in some way. So I think that there's so many lessons that we can garner from exercise, specifically lifting weights, that I think are just, it's a parable for life in many ways.
Absolutely. Well, and your baseline changes too, right? To your point where, a weight is really hard for you for a really long time, and then it gets a little bit easier. That changes your baseline of difficulty. So like for me, for years and years and years, I was stuck at this one weight for an overhead press of 95 pounds. And I'm just now getting to a point where 100 is the baseline. And it seems like such a small thing, but to know that, okay, that's my baseline of like my level of difficulty. And now everything else goes up from there. That is very much like life. It's almost anything else that you go through, whether that's, in school, at work, at home, you create, where's your level of difficulty and how do you move up from there? And how do you see challenges from there?
Why do you think what is the maybe physiological basis for why people really get into weights? Like I am really into weights. Like I've never regretted. Sometimes you're just bagged. You don't feel like it, or I'm running hot. I'm about to get my period. And I'm like, I just don't, the last place I want to be in is in the gym. And then I go to the gym and I'm like, all right, I'm just going to, whatever I got is what I'm going to, is what I'm going to do today. It might not be my best, but I'm here. That's a win. And then I come out and I have all this hope for humanity. And I'm like, everything's better. I sort of joke and say like, I've never regretted a workout I didn't do, right? Or that I did do, sorry. So what is it about, is there a science around why maybe certain individuals have a certain proclivity for lifting weights? Like, what does it do for our psyche?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing is this sense of mastery that we get, right? So once you learn something and you learn how to do something, you do get this sense of, if I can succeed here, then I can succeed in other places as well, right? And you take that into every other aspect of your life. So one of my favorite studies that I read when I was researching the book was they were trying to understand the impact of resistance exercise training, so strength training, on levels of anxiety and depression. And they put these people in an 8-week program. And throughout the program, they gave them tests about their anxiety levels. And everybody who was going into it had just like your sort of standard, regular person living in the world level of anxiety, no anxiety disorder or anything. And what they found was by the end of it, their levels were, I believe it was like a 20% improvement on their anxiety levels, which is pretty significant. And while the study didn't go into why that was the case, when I spoke to one of the leads of the study, he did mention this idea of mastery. And that was his feeling about why that had that impact for the people in the study. What I thought was also important was he told me that the people who were part of it didn't necessarily have perfection when it came to their adherence, right? So sometimes they missed a couple sessions here and there, but when they went into the gym, they did everything they were supposed to do when they were there. So it kind of taught him that, well, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to kind of be this gym rat who's there constantly every single day to get those sort of results. You just have to be consistent with it.
Mm-hmm. And it's, to your point, it's a translatable skill. Like if I can be successful in the gym because I've, been consistent, I've surrendered to the monotony, I'm doing the same thing over and over and over for weeks and months and years on end. How can I take that discipline that I have forged in the gym and move it into another area of my life, my relationship, my career, my parenting, my, insert whatever goal that you might have.
It's the same thing when it comes to, failure in the gym, right? I think that's the most powerful thing that I've learned from strength training, and without question, is how to handle failure. Because a little bit of my backstory was that when I was a kid, I was kind of your standard athletic kid for the first probably 10 years of my life. And then I decided to play Little League baseball when I was about 10 years old. And throughout the time that I was playing, I never hit the ball. Not once. I got on base once for getting hit with the ball and earning an automatic walk. And it was kind of humiliating. And I spent the next probably decade of my life just going, okay, you are not an athlete. You're not cut out for this. You were just not an athletic person. And that's fine. That's who you are as a person. I was maybe like 22, 23. I had to play a softball game for the job that I was working. And I had not, no exaggeration, I had not picked up a baseball bat in 10 years. And I had to, because it was for work. I hit the ball. And afterwards, I ran off to the side of the field and I called my mom and I said, Mom, I'm so excited. I finally, after all those swings and misses when I was a kid, I actually hit the ball. And she said, well, it wasn't that you swung at the ball and missed it all those times. She said, you never swung the bat. And you just sort of stood there. And I realized, oh my God, I've been telling myself this story about who I am and what my abilities are for 10 years of my life, and so afraid to fail again that I didn't even try. Lifting has taught me that failure does not make you a failure, right? That you can go into the gym, you can miss a weight that maybe you should have gotten, that maybe you were trying to strive for, whatever it was. And you start to learn that over time, you're going to go back in and you're going to maybe make a little switch in where you put your feet or your hands or whatever it is. And then you're going to nail that. And if you just even go into the gym and you look at your lifting that way, right? Where you go, okay, I can change this. You go from, that concept of having a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. That's part of one of the huge things that lifting teaches you, is to have that growth mindset to go, failure doesn't make me a failure. It just gives me an opportunity to learn and to take the next steps from here. And what else can I do to be better at this?
Yeah, that is so good. I think failure, it's sort of baked into any gym, right? Or even if any fitness, like we all hear about muscle failure. You got to get as close to muscle failure as you want in order to sort of grow your muscles. And when you are when you hear the word failure in the gym, it doesn't have that sort of negative connotation that it might in a real world scenario. And what I would say is, with my conversations with my community and private clients that I've had and patients that I've had over the years, people are petrified of failure. To your point where, your mom's like, actually, you never actually swung at the bat. We are so afraid of being beginners. We are so afraid of failing. And I don't even think it's I don't even think it's the failing piece. I think it's failing in front of others. We don't want to look dumb or silly or incompetent in front of our peers, our family, even strangers. And you talk about this idea, I think, I don't know if it was a strongman competition, but you were competing and you were, you were worried that you were going to freeze up because you were going to be thinking about what all these people were thinking about.
Yep.
Was it your waist size or was it your shoulder size or whatever? And nobody's thinking that. It's this story, this ruminating sort of story that it occupies most of our minds without our consent, that sort of changes our behavior and our willingness to try new things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, I can't remember a single time or a single person from any of the many competitions I've done where I look back and go, oh, I remember when they failed miserably. Like, I have no idea. We're not really, we think that everyone's watching us and thinking about us, but they're not. But yeah, I'm one of those people where competitions are particularly difficult for me. I am much more likely to hit a personal record in the gym where it's just me and my coach than I am in a competition setting, which is counter to a lot of people where they get that rush of adrenaline and they do much better there. For me, I know that's, I need to go in there with that level of confidence. I actually worked with a performance psychologist when I was getting ready for that national competition because I really wanted to understand a little bit more about this kind of fear of failure that I've had for so long. And one of the most powerful things that she explained to me was you're kind of telling yourself these stories about why you're scared to do something. So you'll say, oh, I'm really afraid of putting the weight over my head because I think it's going to land on my head, or I think I'm going to get injured, or whatever it is. And so when you go to do that lift and you say, oh, well, I'm thinking about those things and that's why I missed it. She was like, well, you know what you need to do. You know all the cues that you have to do to execute that. But what you do instead is you come up with these other reasons why you should be scared. Because you know that if you execute on all the cues and you still don't get it, then you have to face the fact that you're just not strong enough yet to be able to do that. And that's what scares you.
Use the word yet, my favorite word in the English language. Yeah.
Me too. And actually, after I wrote this book, I got it tattooed.
Oh, you did? Oh my goodness.
With a little barbell on the top.
I love that. Yeah, because isn't that so threatening to the ego that if you go all in and you still don't make it, what does that mean? And we just want to make meaning out of it. And it might mean you had a bad sleep. It might be, you're maybe where you are in your cycle, or, there's some stress beyond your control, or maybe it's none of those things. Maybe it's just, you're just having a bad day and there's absolutely no explanation for it. And that's just what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And what an absolute game changer it was for me to have to be forced to go into a competition. And she had me write down all of my cues. So I was allowed to pick 3 or 4 lifting cues for each lift. And I had to have those in a little note in my pocket. And before I went out to do each event, I looked at those, and that was the only thing I was allowed to have in my brain. And I failed a bunch of those events. I was at a national level competition where I, was absolutely not strong enough to be there yet. But I walked out of that competition for the most part, after I had my good cry and feeling sad about it. When I looked back on it, I kind of went, you did everything you could have done. And that is what you were capable of on that day. And that's okay. Because it was the first time, I think, where I walked out of a competition with no regrets. Because I knew that there was nothing else I could have done to have a better chance of making those lifts.
Yeah. What do you think it does for I like to think of courage as a muscle or another skill set that has to be practiced. What do you think doing something that scares you, like, competing in a national level competition that maybe you're not ready for yet, or maybe you don't have the strength or the skills or the experience yet. What does that do for our courage when we attempt things that scare the bejesus out of us? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it completely changes. I know because I've done some research on this, but it changes the way that our brains work, right? It changes the way that we see what our abilities are and what it means to fail at things. There is a really fascinating phenomenon called hysterical strength, which I wrote about a bit. And it's basically so if you've ever heard of the stories of, a mom being able to lift a car off of her her child who's trapped
Yeah,
under,
yeah.
right? And this is somebody who can't lift a car in their day-to-day life. That's hysterical strength. What happens in that situation is when our body is in that really intense fear response, we are able to summon 100% of our strength. And when we're doing that, our brain is also flooded with these pain deadening chemicals. So we don't feel the discomfort of what we're doing. So some of those stories, if you read kind of further on in them, well, that person who lifted a car off of their child or their parent, you find that, they realized later that one of them, I think it was, they were gritting so hard they broke all of their teeth. One was a story of a girl who lifted a tractor off of her father and she was a competitive basketball player, was never able to play competitive basketball again. So, you're able to separate from the pain of it in that situation. But what I found really fascinating about that is that when our brain is scared, our body's involuntary reaction is to produce strength.
When our brains are scared, say that one more time. When our brains are scared,
our body's involuntary reaction is producing strength, right? So we're so scared in that situation of someone who is trapped somewhere that we need to save that our body is able to summon 100% of our strength to be able to do that. And it's not something that anyone's been able to figure out to do in a gym setting, although I do write about one athlete who tried, and I think it's really, really interesting the way he hypnotized himself to do that.
Was this the one who was bleeding? Yeah.
From his eyeballs.
I was going to say, I think he was bleeding from his eyes. Yeah.
Yeah. And he had that similar sort of, post feat reaction to that, where they couldn't get a reading on his heart backstage. He couldn't drive his own car home. It took him weeks to recover. But the point in saying this is that, I think that our bodies and our brains would like to produce strength for us in situations when we're scared. One of the things that I learned in talking to, there's an author who wrote a book about fear and our responses to fear, is that the more that you run towards your fear, the more that you can kind of train yourself to be less scared of it. So he even talked to me about that sort of my situation with baseball as a kid, where he said, you had this reaction to it where you pulled away. But if you had said to your parents, okay, I want to be better at this, let's practice more, let's do more, you wouldn't have had that same fear response over time to it. But because you didn't, because you backed away from it, it became something that scared you for such a long time.
Right. And it's like the neurons that wire together, fire together. So the more scared you are, the more scared you are. And the more scared you are, the more scared you continue to become.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that most of us, I would say women in general, I see this a lot. We underestimate our capacity to generate strength. So I see this in the gym, or I see this in feedback from my community a lot, where I often talk about this idea of, especially in perimenopause, and we'll talk about fitness in our 40s, but one of the, verticals, if you will, is to preserve our tissue as much as we can, particularly muscle tissue, bone tissue, or, organs, all of that. And so in order to preserve muscle tissue, you have to give it the same stimulus that you have, or, ideally, if you're just preserving, we want to also increase. If we can, we want to increase our lean muscle mass. And of course, that requires lifting heavier or changing volume, or reducing the rest time between sets, something like that, right? You're manipulating some lever to make the exercise that you've been doing harder. And so many women, they will say, I'm so scared of getting injured. I'm just happy with the pink, 2-pound dumbbells, and I will just do 4,000 repetitions. And certainly the science will say, hey, that's going to be intense. You are going to still be able to generate intensity that way. But I think that it's, people, I would say women typically will favor doing the high volume, low weight versus doing a lower volume, higher weight. And I think part of it's the stories that we tell ourselves, I don't want to get injured, or, something like that.
Yeah, well, that and the I don't want to get bulky, because they've been told forever, you're going to sniff a dumbbell and get huge. Right? Most of us don't have the genetics that let us do that. Right? Yeah. Listen, there are plenty of people where their body type is that, yes, the more that they lift, the easier it's going to be for them to put on mass. Sure. That is a specific body type where that's true. But it's not everybody. You have to work for it. You have to You have to train in a certain way. You have to be doing hypertrophy training. You have to be eating in a calorie surplus. You have to be eating X amount of protein and carbohydrates. Like you can't, there's a science to it, which is the same reason why you see dudes in the gym working their butts off and then chugging protein shakes, right? They're not, I don't know what makes us as women think that if, the men in the gym have to work so hard to get big that we're just going to magically get
even
big.
On exogenous, even on exogenous, even if they're on some type of, they're on something, they still have to work hard in the gym. Like you can take the testosterone, you can take some of the anabolic steroids, but you still need to mechanically strain the muscle.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think there's this combination of reasons why women do this. And the injury thing maybe is part of it, but I really think a lot of it is this idea of, I'm going to get a body type that I don't want to get. And there was this very influential period of time, unfortunately for me, when I was a teenager and into my early 20s, where that was what all the celebrities were talking about doing in all the celebrity workouts. That's when this idea of tone became a thing, which is my least favorite word maybe in the English language, because it's not a thing. You can't tone. To what people mean when they're talking about toning their muscles and these long, lean muscles, right? It's just having less body fat and more muscle. And the less body fat you have, the more visible your muscle is. But your muscle's going to grow the way it's going to grow. You're not going to create a longer muscle.
Yeah, you're not going to change the attachment point. Yeah, the bicep is still going to cross the coracoid process and it's still going to attach. Yeah, it's going to be the same attachment places that it always was. There's no such thing as a longer muscle.
Yeah, exactly.
I often too, I bristle at the word tone because as someone who spent 16 years in practice looking at real hypo and hypertonia. So this is like, when we talk about tone, this is more of a comment on the nervous system. So whether like a reflex might be hypertonic, hypotonic, normal, absent. So this idea of tone, I was always like, this doesn't really, I know that obviously muscles and nerves, there's obviously they go together, but this is not a comment on on the appearance of the muscular system. It always seemed a bit, I don't know, just misguided to me as well. Talk to me about how, you're in your 40s now when you wrote the book, not quite there yet. How has your training, if at all, changed as you are moving into sort of these perimenopausal years? And what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I joked with somebody recently who was turning 40, because I'm now 42 and I'll be 43 this year. I joked with somebody, I said, oh my God, don't worry about 40. Like when people tell you that everything drops off hill at 40, it's totally not true. It's 42 when that happens.
It's actually, yes.
Because I truly think this was the first year that I was like, oh, I can't just like do whatever for a weekend and run a 5K and just go back to baseline. So I think the biggest thing recently has just been, figuring out that my body is starting to go through some of those changes where the way that I worked out and ate before might be my needs are a little bit different now. But what I do know is that because I've been strength training for so long and I have loved it no matter what, and I would keep doing it whether or not there was like these big health benefits. But what I'm finding more and more is that I'll talk to other moms who are around the same age as me, and they'll say things like, oh my God, I can't believe you did XYZ thing in the gym. I can't even carry my kid from like the living room to their bed. Mm-hmm. And my response to that is always like, but don't you want to? Why don't you want to be able to do that? And I think what is a little scary to me is that these are women who we are approaching those perimenopausal years. And maybe they don't know, but I think in general, we know that when we start to go through menopause, we're going to lose bone density. And what is the only way to build your bone density? By putting load on it through strength training. We know that everybody, not just women, as we get older, right, you're going to start losing muscle mass and muscle strength. And I wish somebody would just tell them, hey, when you combine those two things, loss of muscle mass, and muscle strength, which is going to lead to you having, less balance, for example, and you combine that with the fact that you're going to lose your bone density and you fall, now we have to start worrying about losing our independence in our 50s at that point. And that's terrifying. I don't know why it hasn't been told to more women earlier on that you just have to be strength training. You don't have to do what I do. You do not have to pull a 50-ton truck, but you have to do some level of strength training as you get older if you want to just maintain your health.
Yeah.
your independence as you get
Honestly, I
older.
would take the 2 pounds at 4,000 reps, like rather versus nothing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I don't think that I think humans typically think linearly. So we say, oh, well, my 20s to my 30s sort of felt like this. And then my 30s to my 40s felt like this. And so my 40s to 50s will probably feel maybe like marginally worse, instead of thinking like there is an exponential fall off of a cliff that you are running towards, that you are going, if you don't have the lean muscle tissue, so like the muscle mass that you've been talking about, if you don't have the density of your bones, you are going to fall off of a metabolic and physiological cliff, and you are not going to recover. For it is going to be very difficult to recover. So the falls is certainly one thing that we see. 50s and 60s, and for most, I was doing a presentation. I had these stats memorized right before I presented, so I'll try to recall it now. But it was like 300,000. This is the CDC, so this is just stats from the states. It was 300,000 people per year are hospitalized for falls. Of that, 75% of them are women, and then 50% of the individuals who are hospitalized don't make it within the year. So they are dead within the year, especially if it's a hip fracture. So if we fall and maybe you break you fall on an outstretched hand and maybe you fracture the radius or the ulna, something, you're probably going to recover from that. But if you fall on, you and I live on the East Coast, we live in Toronto, and there's ice and there's rain and sometimes there's black ice, which is like, doesn't look like it's ice, but it really is. And you fall and you break your hip, that is a death sentence for 50% of us. And then the cognitive decline and as you were saying, the loss of independent function is not a joke. It's not a joke. Most people cannot go back to independent living after a hip fracture. Yeah. It's terrifying. And to your point, I don't know why more people are not talking about that, but it's like, well, let's just be the little tiny itty bitty grandma. We can be the little itty bitty grandma instead of the strong. I often joke and say, like, I am training now. So I'm 46. I'm training now. I want to be the favorite grandmother. Like, I want to be, if I'm blessed with grandchildren one day, I want to be able to be the grandma who takes the kid for the day, and then the parents, then my son and his partner are not going to be worried that something's like, I have the capacity, the cognitive and the physical capacity to take care of this child. I can take it to the park. I can get up off the floor. I can, pick it up, all the things. Like, those are the things that I'm really excited about and that I'm training for. So I'm doing lots of squats, lots of deadlifts, like some of the basic movement patterns, overhead press, to be able to pick up the baby and like throw it up in the air. So all of these kind of things, I think, it also comes down to, core values as well, right? So I always try to, I know you and I are very aligned in terms of our philosophy around strength. And I'll also say, I do want to meet people where they are. So if there's someone who's listening, it's like, I never want to do a strongman competition. It's like, okay, I'm probably never going to do a strongman competition either, but I am also going to try to be as strong AF for as long as I can. And maybe I'll need to modify things. Maybe I'll need to change axial loading. Like, I don't know. Maybe I'll need to change things as I age, if I'm injured or whatever. But even through injury, that's not going to stop me from training. I'm just going to modify. I'm going to rehab it, and I'm going to modify the way that I train so that I don't get injured again.
Yeah, and that's it, right? Like, people don't have to do. I sort of say, I went to kind of the fringe of the weightlifting world in this book in the same way as if you ever read Born to Run, right? He went to the absolute extreme of the running world just to bring back lessons that the rest of us can use for picking up gallon water jugs and doing lunges in your living room. Like, that's okay too. Wherever you need to start is fine. And, especially when you talk about kind of the grandmother you want to be and like parent you want to be, one of my favorite things to do with my girls is I can pick them up with each one of them up with one hand and press them overhead.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And they that's fun for me, but their faces, and they love it so much. And, every morning now they make me airplane them to the front door, which involves me holding them directly out in front of me, like the hardest way you can hold something, and go from one end of my house to the other. I don't ever want to have to stop doing that. I hope that even as they get, listen, at some point they're not going to want me to do that anymore, but I'm not going to be carrying teenagers to the front door. But for as long as they want me to be able to do that, I want to be able to do that for them. And I want to be able to train with them if they ever want to do
Yeah.
that.
That's great. My kids are 13 and 11, and what they love to do, so I'll like hold my hand out here, and then they'll like wrap themselves, like, so they'll hold onto my arm and see if I can hold them up, or if my arm is going to drop.
Yeah.
So my 13-year-old, I got to train a little bit because now he's almost the same weight as me. So I gotta work with him. But my 11-year-old loves to hang, and I'm just like, yeah, I can hold you here, buddy. Like, no problem. And he loves it. He loves it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so great. What are some of the things, you mentioned your girls, and part of this podcast is, I want to teach the women who, however old you are right now, you might be 35, 45, 55, 65, 75 listening to the show. And maybe there's a 25-year-old, maybe there's a 15-year-old, maybe there's, a mom of a, 6-year-old and a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old, as you mentioned. What would you love to see for your girls? So when your girls are older, what's the wisdom that you would like to shortcut for them that maybe took you a long time to learn, or maybe you're still learning? Like, what would you like to see for them when they're our age?
Yeah. I mean, I'm bringing it kind of full circle to what we started with, but your body doesn't have to be smaller. Like, you just don't have to spend your entire life trying to be small. You don't. And it's so much more important that you are capable of doing things with the body that you have than that it fits into some pair of jeans that someone else has told you feels important to them. Because no one else cares. No one cares. Just what should matter is what you're able to do with yourself. What do you want to do? What do you want to be able to do? And be strong enough to do that thing. I think I just wish that I hadn't spent so much of my life worrying about what other people thought of how I looked and what clothes I had to wear. And I wish that, certain times I just bought the bigger pair of jeans and just lived with that, and that's okay. And I want them to think that being strong is really cool.
I love that.
Again, they don't have to do what I'm doing. They don't. It's the most extreme end of the sport that I can think of. I love it because it makes me feel every time I do it like I am just invincible. The very first time I ever did strongman, I went into this gym in New York called Global Strongman Gym. And we did a bunch of different things. But the last thing we did is we lifted Atlas stones, which for anyone who's ever watched World's Strongest Man on TV, it's those big like concrete boulders that they kind of pick up and they put on a platform. And at the end of the class, I got assigned to the smallest one. It was 90 pounds. And when I first tried to pick it up, I don't know if I did it the wrong way or whatever it was, I missed it. And that was kind of that fear response, and that fear of failure kind of came back in. I didn't really want to do it again. I went for it anyway, and I ended up getting it up to my shoulder. And I just remember when it was there having this feeling that I could do anything that I wanted to. I could look around that gym at this giant truck tire or this big log or whatever it was. And if I wanted to badly enough, I could lift that. And I remember you talked about being on the subway. I remember leaving the gym and getting on the subway afterwards and looking around with this feeling that like no anyone could like come up and try to mess with me and I could take them.
Yeah.
And nothing had changed about my body structure or my muscles at that point. It was one lift, but it made me feel like I could do anything. And that is what strength training does for you. I think above and beyond anything else is it just makes you feel like you can kind of take on the world.
I love that. That's so great. And I hope that too, we when we think about, the last time you were at a pool, or like, you don't remember, like, we thought that everyone was watching us. No one was watching us. You can't remember the people that were at the pool either. Like, you don't remember their experience. You only remember yours, and no one is watching you. This is what I'm trying to instill with my son right now, who's in his teenage years, which is very, at this stage of his development, very important in terms of what other people think of him. And I keep telling him, like, I get it. It's normal. It's kind of normal. This is what teenagers do. You want to fit in, but I promise you that as you grow up, all you're going to want to do is stand out. So you can kind of go through this process. I'm here to, for all the different stages of your life, and just know that no one's watching you the way that you think that they are,
Yeah. And I mean, listen, that body image stuff is not, we don't talk a ton about this, but that body image stuff is not that much easier for guys either, right? If our ideal is to be smaller, their ideal is to be
it's the
huge,
Adonis
like
complex.
the superheroes that they see. And that is, as we talked about, that is really, really hard to achieve. And so what about the guys who are just naturally skinny? That's terrible for them too.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
yeah.
I know. I'm thinking of, I remember when I would like read comic, like not a ton, but I'd read some comic books or you'd see them in the paper or whatever. And it was so true. It was like this Superman would have all these muscles and then just like this little minuscule waist in the same way that Barbie had, these just like non-human proportions. Like there was no way that she had natural breasts, that waist size, no fat on her legs.
Yes.
And, like she was so,
Yeah.
it was so, it completely messed up with our, female ideals. I think that the same is true for men as well. So yeah, I'm glad that we brought that up, and maybe I'll have.
Yeah. I mean, it's been sold to men as this way for, to go from vulnerability to strength. One of the most interesting things I found when I was doing research for that part of the book was, so, Charles Atlas. Charles Atlas, one of his early advertisements was a comic strip called The Insult That Made a Man Out of Mac. And in the comic strip, you have this skinny guy, Mac, and he's sitting on the beach with his date. And these big guys are they're throwing a beach ball back and forth, and they kick sand in Mac and his girlfriend's face. And, Mac tries to stand up to him, and the guy basically like shoves him out of the way. And he says, okay, I'm not going to be pushed around anymore. I'm going to, for the price of a postage stamp, I'm going to get Charles Atlas's dynamic tension system. And he sends away for it. And then the next thing that you see is he's standing in front of the mirror with his big muscles, and he goes back to the beach, and now he takes on the bad guy at the beach, the big guy. And his date is just like enraptured with him and his abilities now. And now he knows he can do anything. It's really kind of started off this trope for guys of, strength will take you from vulnerability to this place of courage.
Well, you even see that story. You hear that story in bodybuilding. Some of the guys at the Olympia are like, I was a skinny little kid that was picked on. So, that story resonates with a lot of them. And I think the same is true for women. It's often like packaged with like, you're going to be so energized and, there's all this vitality and you're going to have all this, but it's really like, be tiny. Like what you're going to do is you're going to do this diet and you're going to, be tiny. And that's the sort of goal. And I think that we sort of rewrap it. We keep rewrapping, to your point, like don't get bulky, just really get tiny, but energy,
Yeah.
So I would just say, buyer beware, and really for anyone listening, certainly pick up this book. I thought that the stories were so entertaining, and I love, I wouldn't classify myself as fringe. Like I don't go to sort of the strongman competitions or whatnot, but I really enjoyed learning about it. So I think that there's lessons in the fringe in all aspects, in all sort of verticals of life that we can take some really great lessons for. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This was wonderful.
So if people want to find out, are you still competing? If people want to find out what you're doing, like tell us, what's next for you, and then where can people find you?
Yeah. I do have a couple competitions coming up. I have one in February. I post usually all that stuff on my Instagram. So across, I think, all of social media, it's just at Alyssa Ages. And then I have a website if you want to read any of my clips, because I'm also a freelance journalist. The website is alyssaAges.com. And then you can buy Secrets of Giants pretty much anywhere books are sold.
Perfect. And we'll have all these as clickable links in the show notes as well for anybody who wants to check you out. Thank you so much for all of this. It's been just a delight talking to you.
You too. Thank you so much.